and how carbon gets stored or sequestered in the soil. Can grazing increase or decrease soil carbon? And what are the challenges of measuring soil carbon in grazing lands? So soil carbon is both organic carbon and inorganic carbon. But the effect of land use change on soil inorganic carbon is not well understood at this stage. So I'll present organic carbon, which from now on I'll just say carbon, but what it always means in all the presentations from now on, it's the organic carbon. Organic carbon it consists of, it is not one homogeneous soil carbon. It has got a number of fractions depending on what role it plays in soil. For example, what we call a labile organic carbon that turns over faster within months to up to about 10 years, sometimes up to some only days. And that consists of your living organisms in soil. They do a lot of work to turn over the organic matter within soil, as well as the roots that provide the energy for microbes. It's also the fresh residues or litter, and that provides the energy for microbes. It provides carbon for building up their bodies, also nutrients. As they build up their bodies, they respire carbon dioxide, and the nutrient, this organic matter gets mineralized and releases nutrients, and that's for faster growth. It's also can be put together as a what we call particulate organic carbon. Carbon you can easily fractionate or see it, and we put that in the top 53 micron size or 50 micron size. Greater than that is a particulate organic carbon. Then there's a humus, like we used to say, the well-decomposed organic matter is humus. That provides the nutrients as well as it retains the nutrients in soil. And the last fraction is what we call resistant carbon or inert. Some of that is as a charcoal, which could come out from burning of the litter or fire going through, like in saunas. That gets stored as charcoal carbon if it is not taken away through the process of erosion or runoff. So usually in most soils, especially in grazing lands, as much as 30 to 50% of the carbon is in the light fraction, and almost 50% again in the humus fraction. Charcoal can form anywhere up to 30%, but usually it's around 10%. Now, I said the organic carbon, it's a fairly complicated diagram here. What it shows is that when we talk about organic matter, soil organic matter, for example, 58% of the soil organic matter is actually carbon. So carbon and organic matter, you can say they are, in many ways, they are synonymous. But organic matter also contains other nutrients. And when carbon is there in the organic matter, which is about 58, more than 50%, more than half of that is carbon, it does a lot of work within soil. All of that comes from plant biomass, and I'll explain that to you where it comes from. But this is the food for the earthworms, for example, microbes, and they decompose, they release carbon dioxide, which is greenhouse gas sources. It can also be eroded through runoff and erosion with sediments. When it stays in soil, it does a lot of wonders. For example, it provides nitrogen. Almost all nitrogen is tied up with inorganic matter. So carbon, nitrogen, ratio, they are reasonably consistent in a given soil. It also provides phosphorus, sometimes almost half of it, and it also provides to some extent sulfur. For phosphorus, there are other sources as well, which is not organic. For sulfur, other sources as well, which is not organic, like gypsum, that sort of thing. Organic matter is actually the one that pulls together all the soil particles into aggregation. So it aggregates together. It makes it soil friable, and when you walk, it's a real pleasure to walk on rather than really compact soil. So it provides aggregation, makes it fluffy. Areas that helps in air movement, water movement through the systems, and lower bulk density, for example. So the roots can go through that system fairly quickly. Soil organic matter, or carbon for that matter, provides buffer to the soil. Like it doesn't change pH that quickly. It also holds on your nutrients, our nutrients that are used for like calcium, magnesium, potassium, used for pasture growth. The other function it does is the environmental function. It holds on to pesticides for a while so that microbes can act on it and degrade it, and if they are moved through the systems, they are not as poisonous, or they become almost non-poisonous systems. So this is just a part of this where it plays a major part in terms of providing nitrogen, to a large extent also phosphorus, and to some extent sulfur to the soil. And they to soil, and once they are mineralized in soil, they are taken up by the plants, and the plants are used by animals. So cycle repeats itself. It's important to understand that all of that organic matter that's in soil, it goes through soil microbes. Microbes decompose it, mineralize it, it holds it in there, and that becomes humus. And humus, for that matter, provides a reasonable constant ratio of carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. As I said, in many soils, especially sandy soils and soils that haven't got a lot of capacity to store calcium, magnesium sort of thing, organic matter is the major constituents that provides cations holding capacity. It holds calcium, magnesium, potassium, so that they are not easily sort of leached. It also provides some insoluble phosphates, for example, inorganic phosphate, the complex with the organic matter, and are made available to plants in a soluble form. The other important function of soil organic matter, and for that matter carbon, is it's a source of food for earthworms, many of the other major sort of microorganisms, nematodes, fungi, protozoa, arthropods, insects, pets, and herbivores. It not only provides food, but it protects from the adverse conditions from predators, and it's the essential component of the soil that goes through these microbial or macroorganism systems. In terms of holding the soil together by soil organic matter, it's also soil holds organic matter together as well. So it's a combination of those ones to form as aggregates. So as we increase organic matter in soil, in this example I've shown the increase in total organic carbon, which is if you take it that twice of that one would be organic matter. It increases the capacity to have more water stable aggregates, which is another way of saying it. The soil is more aggregated. It improves soil structure, reduces bulk density, and in sandy soils, it holds water holding capacity. improves aeration, improves infiltration. As it rains, more rainfall goes into the ground rather than runoff, and it provides good tills for cropping soils, or even seeds that pasture seeds that fall on the ground for their germination. So to put that into context, it improves productivity because it provides nutrients. It enhances the buffering capacity to adverse conditions, droughts, floods. It reduces soil erosion, and by reducing soil erosion, lower sediments, fewer sediments end up in creeks and rivers, and that way it protects water bodies, both inland and what goes off from the land onto the sea and oceans. Now, how does soil carbon enter into soil? I think the last time Richard Eckhart presented a graph including animals. I'll present that for soil and plants. So, all of the carbon that enters in the soil, it is through the photosynthesis process, which is through the green plants and shrubs and trees. And that green plants and shrubs and trees, they store carbon from the combination of solar radiation, sunlight, must have water, and it stores carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which is called sequestration, and forms as the organic carbon, and through the litter and the roots, it adds up carbon as a soil organic matter. So when you put that into the context, how much carbon is below our feet, in the top 1 meter of soil contains 1,500 gigatons or billion tons of organic carbon in the top 1 meter of soil. If you can add inorganic carbon as well, like calcium carbonate, lime, and that sort of things, it's another 950 billion tons. So either alone or put them together in the top 1 meter, when you consider how much is carbon dioxide in the atmosphere above, it's about 850 billion tons. And in the plants, all the greenery we see is 600 billion tons. So compared to these two put together, there's more organic carbon in soil than it's in the plants or trees or grasses and in the atmosphere put together. So that's why it's quite important in terms of not only what carbon does in soil, but also how important it is to soak up the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through plants or trees into the soil. And that's called soil carbon sequestration, or sequestering carbon from the atmosphere into the soil. Now, someone may ask how much carbon is in my soil. The carbon in the soil is how much is the total carbon, you put it in there, how much is the outputs, that's microbes and all the organisms working on it, decompose it, and the large part of that one ends up as carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And the balance of these one, what's the input and what's the output, is the organic carbon level at any time in the soil. So I think Zeb Baldock had a bucket sort of a scenario that these say water level in soil depends on how much water is coming out from the top tap and how much water is going out from the bottom tap. So that's the scenario, very similar to how much carbon we put it in there and how much carbon is taken out. Now, it's a good question to ask how much carbon we do put into the soil. The soil carbon levels in natural systems depend on what's the climate, like temperature, rainfall, vapor pressure deficit, What's the vegetation type, whether it's trees or grasses? What is the soil texture, whether it's a clay soil or a sandy soil, or sometimes in clay soils, what's the kind of clays we have? For example, some of you might have heard kaolinite clay or smectitic clay, and sometimes you see in the red soils the iron and aluminum oxides. They are quite important to determine what carbon content levels there would be. It also depends on what the topography is at, top of the landscape and bottom of the landscape. And the important point is how long it has taken or is taking to build up that soil, in that soil. So there are 5 factors that are important: climate, vegetation type, soil type, topography, and time. They are the natural sort of formation factors. They stay constant. They are the, if you have disturbed the soil for a long time, that's the level would be determined by these 5 factors. Now, as humans, we have made a land use change, and that land use change would result in different levels of carbon. That land use change could be rotation, fallow management, tillage, stubble management, stubble removed or retained. We do fertilizing the crops or irrigation. That's crops. We could have pastures. We could have agroforestry, afforestation, reforestation, plantations, or you decide to add carbon to the soil as organic amendments, like through manures, biochar, and sometimes the people have been adding lignite. So this is a graph made by John Carter quite some time back, and what it shows is that what's the levels of surface soil carbon in top centimeter in Queensland soils. The basic sort of information that comes out is that soil carbon levels decrease when we go from east to west, and they also decrease as we go from south to north. It's just a function of the rainfall, the temperature, the vapor pressure deficit. Vapor pressure deficit means how effective the rainfall is. Like 400 millimeters rainfall in Long Reach is not as effective as it is, for example, in eastern areas if you get that much of rainfall, because the temperature is not that high and it doesn't evaporate water that quickly without going through the plants. Now, some of the, I'll give the basic sort of what changes can take place if you have got land use change. This is an example from, I think, Kingroy, South Burnett area, but that could be anywhere in cropping lands. So this area was cropped for 55 years, and then next area where from cropping for some time, they put in under pasture 33 years of cropping, then put pasture for 22 years, and the third option was that from this pasture they put in the plantations, hardwood plantation, and that was at that time when we measured it was 4 years plantation. When you look at the graph here, you find that the carbon in soil, which is in gray, is as much as the carbon in the top scrub vegetation. When you take that one away and clear that one up, the carbon after about 55 years, instead of 220 tons, it's left about 70 tons. So a fair bit of was lost. And so we put in pasture from, for example, after this 33 years of cropping put in pasture, it does increase soil carbon, but it could have been around that level and increase to that level. You put in plantations, there is an increase in carbon in top trees as well, but slight increase in soil. So you need plantations of 25 years, sometimes to increase the carbon to the level which seems to be similar to what it was before, but in the top ones you might have to have nearly 50 years to get to that level. So just an idea. there is, I'll put in an example of what's happening in carbon farming initiative, and that's one of the methodologies that has come out, sequestering carbon in soils in grazing systems, and the land management activities that may be eligible on this under this methodology are converting land from continuous cropland to pasture, permanent pasture, a change in pasture management that can put in irrigation, or you may have fertilization, or pasture improvement. You can have changing grazing practices. In some cases, pasture improvement may be just tilling the land. As you know, in many of these buffer pasture areas, buffer pasture condition declines over time, and some graziers sort of tickle it with tan operations or some tillage operations. Now, I'll put in some example of converting from continuous cropland to permanent pasture. This is the example where you start from land use change. Before land use change, say let's say the level was here, and with cropping it decreases as usual. We have done it for many years. But when you put in pasture, depending on where you start pasture levels, this how much carbon has been lost before. We put in pasture, that level will be usually higher than when the land has already been depleted of carbon. That will be the lower level. And we did that around the area, Roma area, some time back, where red soils were opened up for cropping in 70s and 80s, and in late 90s and early 2000 they put in under pasture. And what we find is that the increase in carbon, the change in carbon, this is the total carbon stock. You find that longer it has been under pasture, here slower is the increase in carbon. So what happens is that there is depletion of other nutrients as well. Like when carbon has gone up in the atmosphere, it releases nitrogen. That nitrogen was used by the crop and phosphorus for that matter. So the soil is depleted of nutrients. When you put under buffer pasture without too many legumes, then the recovery of that soil carbon is much slower if there is more nitrogen and phosphorus have been taken away from the system. So that's simply what it means. More degraded the soil is, lower are going to be the carbon sequestration benefits. It might take much longer unless you put in fertilizers and that sort of things. And I will come to that one by putting in nitrogen, for example, as a fertilizer. You need to account for a few other things. Like if you put in fertilizers, you also need to consider another greenhouse gas besides carbon dioxide. There are two other main greenhouse gases: nitrous oxide, which comes from generally fertilizers or nitrogen realization from soil, and the other one is methane that comes from animals, belching by the animals. Nitrous oxide, for example, is 300 times more potent in global warming than carbon dioxide is. So a small amount of nitrous oxide emission, like 1 kilogram, would be as much as 300 kilograms in terms of carbon dioxide effectiveness. And all of them are converted into that one currency. Methane, it's about 25 times, and 1 kilogram of methane is equal to 25 kilograms of this carbon dioxide. So when you come to CFI or carbon credits, it's 25 kilograms that's counted, although 1 kilogram of methane was emitted by animals. So these sort of aspects need to be taken into account. In pasture improvement, for example, you do tillage, there may be some nitrous oxide leakages, and if you've got grazing, then you need to also account for methane. Now, how is soil carbon measured? Soil carbon is fairly variable in soil. It's a variable landscape. And I'll give an example from actually the soil carbon, that methodology for grazing systems, where if you got that paddock where you are interested in, you divide that into quadrants, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. You can divide into 9 or divide into 4. It's very similar sort of strata, we call it, and take samples from each one of them to make that effective. That's how you take samples. You may decide that you are interested in only in this paddock, not in this one. So greatest challenge for getting a reliable estimate of soil carbon is taking the representative sampling of the landscape, representative sampling of the landscape for carbon. Now, once you have taken samples, need to get these samples, for example, get them processed. You have to grind them, process them, put through 2 millimeter sieve, and when you're doing total carbon, you need to put in finer than the 2 millimeter sieve, sometimes 100 micron or very fine grinding, so that you make it homogeneous sample of soil. And this is one of the instruments, LICO or Elementar or anything that analyzes total carbon will give you the idea of how much carbon is there in the soil. There are alternative or other techniques, like in this case it's done LICO directly, but you can also estimate carbon from near infrared or mid infrared regions. For example, this is we do by standard carbon, LICO, as I said before, but you can also do by mid-infrared spectroscopy. It is quite promising, and it can be cheaper. I'll come to that one later. What it is showing a promise, quite promising, but it needs to be rigorously tested, and this is the standard against which this mid-infrared MIR will be tested. It does reduce the cost of analysis. There is another technique, like from LICO, you go mid-infrared. You can also go to near-infrared spectroscopy. And this is the on-the-go field and near-infrared spectroscopy here. It's or NIR, they call it. It's at the tip of this core. It goes into the ground. It measures it. It records it. And you can get the information almost straight away. But always remember that this field-based NIR has the potential to rapidly measure soil carbon, but it needs to be rigorously tested against standard techniques. This has been thoroughly, reasonably well tested. This does require further testing, but it has got the potential to reduce the cost of analysis, although it does increase the error of estimate. As we go from there, this is standard, increases with error of estimate further, and this is with more. Now, all the emphasis is that we are working towards the cost-effective soil carbon measurement, and that's the desired goal. You could also, once you have done the baseline by standard technique, you can go through the modeling technique, and that can reduce the cost much further. Like the Commonwealth of Australia's full-cam model that can be used, ROPSI model, and there are other models like this is century sort of thing, and they take into account a number of factors to get the estimates of soil carbon, and that does reduce the cost further because you can do the run of the models away from the field, but you do need field data to carbon offsets. So in summary, carbon is sequestered in soil by lay pastures through pasture management, pasture and agroforestry, plantation forestry, afforestation of degraded lands, reforestation using best practice, and you could add amendments like manure, etc. to increase carbon in soil. But always remember there are other things to have got what we call unintended consequences. Like if you are grazing your pasture, you need to take into account the methane uptake. You need, if you are putting fertilizers, then you need to take into account nitrous oxide. So when you're talking about carbon credits, these nitrous oxide and methane, they are also counted in the total credits or offsets. So key messages are that soil carbon provides multiple benefits, and without carbon it's just dirt. How much carbon is there in soil naturally depends on climate, soil types, vegetation, topography, and time. There's 5 factors, just like 5 fingers on hand. The way we manage soil can change this level, but rarely exceeds natural levels, unless soil was very low in phosphorus or other nutrients, and by adding nutrients, you can go above that what was before. Carbon Farming Initiative provides methodology for soil carbon grazing systems for carbon offsets. Direct measurement of carbon for baseline, I believe, is costly at the moment, but research is ongoing to reduce the cost of carbon measurement. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ram. That was a fantastic overview of soil carbon and how to measure it. So we have a few questions coming in. As I'd like to mention, if you do have a question for Ram, if you could please type it into the question pane, which is in the toolbar on the right-hand side of your screen, and I can ask it to Ram. So if you do have a question, please type it in and send it through. The first question here, Ram, is how fast do roots die and regrow? Is what you see above the ground an indicator of the health or weight of the roots below the ground?
Yeah, in grazing lands, I think let's talk about the grasses or pastures. There's as much carbon in roots below ground, sometimes twice as much carbon below ground in the roots as it in the tops. And how long does it take to recycle? I think within a year, more than 50% or more of those roots do get recycled. Depending on if it is dry season, I think it might take longer, but because it does need moisture to decompose. But that's approximately, I think, we take it in modeling about a year, more than 80% of the roots will be turned over.
Okay, thank you. I'd also just like to mention that there is an evaluation on today's webinar, so we'd appreciate your feedback. So if you could please click on the link that's in your question or chat pane, or you'll see an email sent to you after the webinar. And please click on that link and fill in the online evaluation, as we appreciate your feedback. The next question here is, does humus or soil organic matter contribute much fertility to clay soils, which have a large capacity to bind nutrients, example, magnesium and calcium?
Yeah, that's I've been working on clay soils for a long time, mostly cropping lands, but also in the grazing lands as well. It does contribute. It does contribute, for example, nitrogen. All of that nitrogen that the plants take up, that comes from the organic matter breakdown. In terms of holding calcium and magnesium in there, obviously the clay soils have got a large capacity to hold calcium, magnesium. So contribution on that part would be much smaller for soil organic matter than it would be on sandy soils. Thank you.
Okay. The next question we have is pasture improvement CFI methodology. Would this include practices with more subtle improvements, example spelling?
Yeah, it does include that one. Yeah. So it's not spelled out, but it does include the pasture management for the timing, the rate, the stocking numbers, all those things. Yeah, they are in there. Thank you.
Next question. How do you increase soil carbon levels in aged buffel pasture, the buffel grass?
Yeah, that's a real challenge, because when we put in buffel there, in most of those soils, there was enough nitrogen to start with, but soon the roots, which are twice as much as they are on top soil, top of it for grazing, the roots hold on a lot of nitrogen, and they recycle that nitrogen fairly slowly. So they do run out of nitrogen. That's rundown pastures. How you can improve that one? It has been a challenge. I think some farmers or graziers have gone into do a bit of tilling every few years, and that breaks down organic matter and releases more nitrogen and nutrients and rejuvenates it. We have thought of putting in legumes, but once the buffel is established, introducing legumes in there is a very difficult job, because the soil remains, buffel roots are such that they take up water as quickly as the rainfall falls in there, and doesn't allow enough sort of water for the legumes, for example. They may establish, but they may not grow as well. So it's always a challenge. But I would be quite happy to hear otherwise that you can do it.
Okay, the next question, we've got a couple of questions around the cost. What is the current cost of baselining and a carbon test at the lab?
Yeah, it's I think it does vary a fair bit. Some labs charge as much as $50 for LECO carbon. That's the total carbon. It could be in some labs it could be as low as $30. So it's anywhere from maybe $20 to $30. It varies there. If you don't do LECO, if you have done LECO carbon once for baseline, the other times, if you go for mid-infrared, for example, if it's well calibrated, you can reduce the cost to as low as $20. And we are hoping that ongoing research could reduce it is even much further, less than $10 on the go technology. As I said, NIR, and the projects are underway of reducing that even further. For setting up the other costs, I think I would be a bit less certain. For example, soil sampling, there is an estimate that it could cost anywhere per sample, anywhere from $15 to $40. So some guys have put that cost to about $30, and that you can find on online. I think some estimates of that one. Then you may think about the legal costs, legal advice, for example. You may think of you need to also have initial accreditation of that one. You may annual statement preparations. You may insurance, and estimates on all those things like accreditation costs can cost anywhere from $2,000 to $3,000, but that's not per sample; it's for the whole sort of setup. Legal cost, I don't know how much you charge. Maybe friendly legal advisor could be $1,000, and others, well, it could be anywhere from $1,000 to $3,000. So annual statements, for example, that cost as well, and put in a bit of insurance too. So I can give you only estimate, but you need to have an advisor you can go to and get the figures that are reliable. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ram. I'd just like to remind everyone that today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Leading Sheep website. So if you missed something that Ram covered today or would like to pass on to others in your area or your network, please jump on the Leading Sheep website, which is www.leadingsheep.com.au. Okay, next question, Ram. If a landholder has about 1,000 hectares of a soil type in a large paddock, how many tests might be needed in that soil type?
Depends what is, if the soil is fairly, so I think it's not changing too much. When you can see it's all gray clays, for example, not the light red there or other sort of systems going through. There's no sand ridges and that sort of thing. If it's fairly uniform soil, you can get away with anywhere from 10 to 20 samples, I think, and you can, as I said before, you can composite them into maybe less than 10 and take a few more samples from make a sort of divide that area properly, have quadrats or whatever the number is, strata, and from each strata take few samples and composite them into fewer samples for reducing the cost, but taking into account that you have taken representative samples from that paddock. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. The next one here is, what is the rule of thumb for the amount of nitrogen released through organic matter mineralisation? So they're saying kilos of nitrogen per hectare for every % carbon in the soil.
All right. Yes, the we should always remember that when carbon is released, when nitrogen is released, carbon is also mineralized at the same time as carbon dioxide. So as you lose organic matter, nitrogen does more nitrogen becomes mineral nitrogen, which is taken up by plants. The general rule of thumb is in good systems, its carbon nitrogen ratio is 10 of carbon to 1 to nitrogen, but in many of the rangeland systems it will be as wide as 15 kilograms of carbon to 1 kilogram of nitrogen. So if you have sort of mineralized or lost 15 kilograms of carbon, then you might gain 1 kilogram of nitrogen from the system. Just a rule of thumb.
Great. Do soil microbes emit methane?
So that's a good point. Some soil microbes do, like if you get waterlogged conditions for a long time, actually soil microbes, what we call methanogen microbial group, they actually sort of emit methane. Like you might have seen in wetlands, in paddy lands, that sort of things, and it's the methane that coming out from the soil microbes that have broken down the organic matter, and they use that organic carbon in there to produce methane. Yes. There's another point worth recording here. There are many soils which don't get waterlogged. Many soils where the water doesn't stay for too long. There are microbes in soil, what we call methanotropes, that actually use methane from the atmosphere, from soil, to convert that methane into carbon dioxide, and some of that they store. So from 25 times more effective in global warming, they can reduce that to 1 time. So 25 times benefits for these what we call methanotropes. So they will do both. This soils have got both. In wet conditions, waterlogged conditions, they release methane. In good conditions, organic matter, friable soil, they actually reduce methane from the atmosphere as well as in soil. So there could be benefits. There are benefits in some systems, and they may be releasing methane in the other systems. So net effect is depending on what the conditions is in soil at a given time. Thank you.
So the next question we have here, it's a bit of a comment to start with, and then a question towards the end. So it appears that in self-mulching soils found in southern Queensland, the nature of the soil constantly turning over, and also the depth of the topsoil, that increases in soil carbon are minuscule as compared to granite-type soils with a very small depth of topsoil. How can results from our soils, being the southern Queensland ones, be recognised when comparing different soil types?
That's true that in many of the self-mulching soils, the top 10 centimeter, even top 20 centimeter, may not have as decreasing carbon levels with depth as you will have in sort of granitic soils coming out from so sandy soils where most of the carbon could be in the top layers and not a lot stored below. So what they have done internationally, that they have come up with one depth, 0 to 30 centimeter depth is recognized for carbon credits, carbon offset process. And that what it means is that most of the changes that take place when you have land use change, let's say from cropping to pasture or from pasture to forestry, they take place in the top 10 centimeter and at the most maximum 30 centimeter depth. So if you take into account the full depth that's allowed in carbon credits, most of these effects, what we are talking about, and they are considered and taken into account, and you don't get disadvantage if you are on self-mulching soils on the southern Darling Downs. Thank you.
Okay, so we've got one last question. So if there's anyone else that's got a last-minute question they'd like asked to Ram, please type it into your question box. The last question we have here is how many carbon estimation areas would be required on that 1,000 hectares we referred to earlier?
Yeah, I think for that one you need to think well in advance. Think 5 years from now, 10 years from now, or 15 years from now. And also what your objective is. If you think that changes in your carbon, soil carbon or carbon stock we call it, in the top 30 centimeter depth are a bit slower, you may end up doing more carbon estimation areas. Then if you find there's a rapid change or rapid build-up in soil carbon. What it means is that more carbon estimation areas you have, greater is the sensitivity in picking up those small changes and allowing for carbon offsets. But also remember that you have to have the balance between benefit cost analysis. So there's not one answer you can give on that basis. So it would have to be your personal decision. It would have to be the soil type you're looking at. It would have to be the management practices you have put into the carbon credits, carbon offset scheme. So you can have, as we say, 4 carbon estimation areas, you can have 2 or you can have 10. So there's not one answer I can say definitely give that many carbon estimation areas there should be. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Ram. That's all the questions we have for today's webinar. So firstly, I'd just like to thank yourself for presenting today's webinar and giving us your time. It's very much appreciated and we found it very informative. I'd also like to thank Dave for helping organise today's webinar.
Thank you to you and thank you to the audience. Yeah.
Thanks, Ram. And along with the Making More from Sheep project, who's hosted today's webinar, as well as the support from the Future Beef and Letting Sheep projects. So just before everyone goes,